In this 4-part video series, I'm going to share all of my tips and tricks for catching winter steelhead. This is part 2, floats and beads. I'm Barry Rager, welcome to my channel, Rage Fishing. On this channel, I cover all types of fishing throughout the state of Oregon, but there's no species I'd rather be chasing than winter steelhead. So in this 4-part series, I'm going to go over in detail the 4 methods of catching winter steelhead that I use, starting with floats and jigs. I've already done that in part 1. You can go back and watch that if you want first. I'll put the link above. This is covering floats and beads, so part 2. In part 3, I'm going to cover drift fishing, and in part 4, I'm going to go over hardware, which is spinners and spoons. For each technique, I'm going to explain the why and the when to fish each method. I'm going to go over the gear you'll need, rods, reel, line, and tackle. I'm going to go over the rigging in detail. I'm going to explain how to fish each technique, and at the end, I'm going to give you some bonus tips as well. So let's get started with part 2, floats and beads. So we'll start out with the why and the when. Now, I was a little bit late to the bead fishing game just because I was perfectly happy catching steelhead with floats and jigs, drift fishing, and spinners. However, as bead fishing gained popularity, I figured there's got to be something to this, and I started doing some experimenting. And the day it all came together was a rainy day where David and I were fishing really hard. We weren't having a lot of success with other methods. David actually hooked the first fish that day on a pink colored bead, if I remember correctly. But at the end of the day, I hooked 3 steelhead on consecutive casts on red 10mm BNR soft beads. And at that point, I realized I have to make it part of my arsenal. I actually kept those 3 riggings. I'm one of those type of people. But these are the 3 riggings I caught those first 3 fish on. I usually fish beads after running a float and jig through a section of holding water. So most of the fish that you've seen caught on this channel with beads has been after I've already run a jig through that section. Now, each one of these methods can be used under a variety of different water conditions, but each has their specialty. For me, floats and beads work the best when the water's at a medium height. So when you might have a little bit more trouble running a float and jig just because there's a little bit more turbulence, the weighting system on a bead rig keeps that weight and bead down near the bottom, so it's always in the strike zone. So now let's talk gear, starting with rods. Now this is the rod that I have been using. It's a G Loomis E6X. It's the 1143. It's 9'6", medium light power, fast action. It's rated 6 to 12 pound test. Now a few times this has felt a little bit light for some of the bigger fish, so I actually stepped up this year to a little bit stouter rod. I bought a Striker 9'9". Let me show you that real quick. Now, Striker is a local company made here in Eugene, Oregon. I bought 2 of these rods, one for jig fishing, one for bead fishing, to try out this winter steelhead season. This one's a little bit stouter than my E6X. It's a medium power, so it's 1 step up. It's a moderate action, which is a little softer than my E6X, but that's a good thing because, again, that moderate action flexes more into the middle and acts as a huge shock absorber for those running steelhead. So I'm really looking forward to using that rod. I'll show you one more rod really quick. I know that not everybody wants to spend a ton of money on fishing equipment, but this is a good entry-level rod. I actually did a gear review on it. I'll put a link above. But this is a Lamiglass X11. It's 9.5 foot. It's a decent rod for the price. I have it so that I can let David use it when he flies down from Washington, or if like Haley comes down to go fishing and I just want her to have a bead rod. And so that's what I set her up with. But a decent rod for the money. I like to use spinning reels for all of my float fishing just because there's very little resistance to peel that line off the spool when you're extending your drift. Just like with my jig rod, I put a Shimano Vanford 3000 on my bead rod. It's a great reel. I know they're spendy, $250, but next time you're at your whatever sporting goods store you use, check one out. They're incredible reels. 6.3 ounces for a size 3000 spool. I generally use a 3000. A few of my reels are 2500s, but that's getting kind of light on the line capacity. The 3000 I think is a perfect size for steelhead fishing. So moving on to line. Now I recommend using braid. I use Power Pro Super Slick V2, this 30 pound test in the aqua green color. The aqua green just allows you to see it just a little bit better for mending purposes, and braided line floats. You're gonna need a bumper material and I recommend using P-Line CXX or Maxima Ultra Green, and I use 12 or 15 pound test. You want a stiff mono so that your float slides on it very easily. Now as far as leader material, I use Seeger in 10, 12, or 15 pound test depending on water levels and clarity. I recommend either using the blue label or the orange label, which is the Steelhead version. It's about a quarter of the cost. I'll just let you know, 100 yards of this costs about the same as 25 yards of the blue label. But Seeger is good stuff, and that's what I've been using for the last year. As far as floats, I like the AF5 and AF6 floats from Hawk and Fishing. Just like with jig fishing, it's really important to know what your gear is doing, and these posts really allow you to read this bobber so that you know that you're fishing it correctly. So to be fishing correctly, you want to make sure that your weighting system is touching bottom, and those posts allow you to know when that's riding correctly, and if it's bouncing off the bottom, the tip will kind of be pointed downstream. So this is what I have tied on the majority of the time. This is an AF6 1/4 ounce. They make this in an 1/8 ounce as well. These are weighted. And then if you move up in your weighting system, they also make the AF5, which is a similar float, and it comes in 3/8, 1/2 ounce. These are the high vis ones with the bright yellow, and it even comes in a 5/8, so you can see how big that float is right there. But those are the floats that I use exclusively. Now you're going to need a weighting system to get your bead down to the bottom. And I use the Dave's tangle-free stick weights, and I use them with the tangle-free method. I did a complete video explaining why. I'll put a link above if you want to go back and watch that. But essentially what it is each of these stick weights, they're matched to size for these different bobber weights. So 1/8 ounce, 1/4 ounce, 3/8, 1/2 ounce, and 5/8. And the stick weight has an eye on it. I put that on a split ring with 2 barrel swivels. I tie one of the barrel swivels to my bumper material and one to my leader material. The reason I started using this is because I had some break-offs last year using a dropper swivel, and I kind of realized that the dropper swivel was to blame for losing a couple fish. So this way, when you cast, that weighting system is leading, and therefore it doesn't get tangled up in your leader and bumper material. But I would recommend using the Dave's tangle-free stick weights. They also make a weight that has kind of more of a ball appearance. I get these hung up too easily. A lot of the rivers I fish are bedrock, and these just go down in a crevice and don't come out. So I like the stick weights. They don't get hung up as much, but if your river has sand or a gravel bottom, either of them will work. For hooks, I use Bloodrun Skeena hooks. Now this is a straight shank hook. They're very sharp. They're like an owner mosquito hook, but they're a little bit heavier gauge wire. The sizing is slightly different than the mosquito. The size 2 Skeena hook is about the size of a size 4 owner mosquito. So I generally will use the size 2 when the water is really low and clear. And when the water is a little bigger, I'll use a size 1. And I even have some 1/0s for bigger fish or heavier flows. But Bloodrun Skeena hooks, great hooks. They're fairly inexpensive. I get them in the 25 pack. Now for the most important part of this gear list, the beads. Now I've caught most of my steelhead on B&R soft beads. The sweet pink cherry has been my #1 producer. But some other colors that I would recommend, the pink pearl, I've had good luck with that one. Also the pink mottled. The pink pearl and the pink mottled work really good when the water's low and clear. But surprisingly, I even have good luck on sweet pink cherry when the water's low and clear. Some other colors to consider, the red. I'll never discount red. Red always works in all different types of water conditions, and this was my top producing bead when I first got started. And then I slowly started getting more hookups with the pinks, and then I found that sweet pink cherry. Last year, Hawk and Fishing came out with beads. They're called the DRO beads. They have some really good colors. They seem to be just a little bit more durable, just a little bit tougher than the B&R soft bead, and I've been experimenting a little bit with them. And like this one here is really a good color. It's called the Steelhead Pink. I would recommend trying some of those. And they have a pink pearl as well. It's a pretty cool color. And they have a mottled as well, and that's the Mottled Pink. I also like this color here. I haven't necessarily had success with it, but I like the idea of it. It's kind of an orange color. And then last year I also did some experimenting with DRO beads, and they have these hex beads. and they basically have some flat sides to them. And I actually had a hookup with one of those as one of the last steelhead I caught this last season. So if the water is really low and clear, I would recommend sticking with a 10 to 12 millimeter bead. If the water is a little bit bigger, like a medium height, I would recommend using a 12 to 14 millimeter bead. And for really big water, you can bump up to a 16 or 20 millimeter bead. I know it sounds crazy, but people have been having luck with these really big beads. These are 20 millimeter sweet pink cherries. I haven't tried those out yet, but I'm hoping to do that this year if we get some high water. I'm going to be testing a bunch of different colors, sizes, and brands this year, so make sure to follow along and I'll keep you updated. So now let's go over the rigging in detail. I'm going to use this loaner rod, the Lamaglass X11, to show you how I set up my rigging step by step. So I've got it spooled up with Power Pro Super Slick. The first thing you're going to need to do is tie a bumper to the braid. I'm going to use some Ultra Green 12-pound test. Now my wingspan, and I suggest you measure this, it just helps you on the river, from hand to hand is 5 feet. And that just helps me that if I have just a spool of line, I know that that's approximately 5 feet. So that's 5, 10. You're going to want to tie about 10 to 12 feet of bumper material. But that all depends on how deep of river you're fishing. You want it to at least be able to touch the river's bottom. So I'm going to tie this on with an Alberto knot. If you don't know how to tie an Alberto knot, I'll put a link above to a video where I demonstrate how, but it's a splice knot. So tie that on real quick. I like the Alberto knot because it has a very small diameter. It goes through the guides real easily, even when you're fighting a fish. I cut the braid off with some braid scissors here, and I cut the mono portion off with fingernail clippers because you can get it very close so that it doesn't get caught up in your guides. So there we have our bumper material. Next, you want to put on some Dacron bobber stops. Now I use 2, and the reason being is because one of them might fall off, and 2 gives you just a little bit more resistance on the line. So they come on these little tubes. Slide those on your line, on your bumper material. Pull the Dacron off, get rid of the tube, and just pull those ends together. So there's one. For this setup, I have a pink and a yellow. So we got our Dacron on there. Now arrow floats come with these bright yellow beads. I really like those because they're easy to see even from distances. So you're going to want to put that on next. And that just keeps your float from going up over the Dacron. So I'm going to put on an AF6 1/4 ounce float. This is the one I use the majority of the time. So put that on. Now this is a step that I highly recommend. Put a rubber bobber stop under your float for 2 reasons. One of which is if your weighting system gets hung up and you break that off, you might just save your float. The second reason is you can kind of set that rubber bobber stop so that it's a little bit away from your weighting system, so when you cast in, your gear gets down just a little bit quicker. So you want to put a red or just another bead on. I just use red. It's not as important on color because it's underneath. And then I use Bomac 4 to 8 pound test rubber bobber stops. They come like this, and they're just on a little wire with a loop. And so you put your line through that wire loop, hang on to it, and just pull that rubber bobber stop onto your line. So now you want to tie on your Dave's Tangle Free system. And to explain this again, it's a split ring with 2 barrel swivels on the split ring and the Dave's Tangle Free weight hanging off of that. So tie your bumper material to one of those swivels. I use a trilling knot, 2 loops through the eye. Very strong knot, 5 wraps. Always wet your knot, just ensures that it lays down the way it's supposed to. Now you're gonna need your leader material. Now I keep my leaders in pips boxes. And I've got one already pre-rigged up here. I'll show you how I tie these rigs in just a second, and I'll show you how the pips box work as well. But I'm gonna take my leader material out. Now on my leader material, I have a mark right at 30 inches with a Sharpie. So I'm gonna tie my leader material on and pull that right to that black mark so that it's right at 30 inches. Cut the tag end off. Now on your Dacron, you're gonna wanna cut those off to about 1/4 inch or so. You want those to be able to go through your guides okay, so I just kind of hold on to those. You can use your boomerang tool or some small scissors. And there you have it. There's your tangle-free method of rigging. So I'd also mention just real quick that I know that there's people out there that don't want such a convoluted mess of a rigging. So one thing you can do, and I grabbed Haley's rod. I don't know if you watched Steelhead Adventures Part 2, but it's worth watching. My daughter Haley caught a steelhead with this rod right here, and it's still rigged up just the way we had it when we were fishing. But what you can do for a simple bead rig, this is how my dad fishes a bead rig, is you can use an AF7 float like I have on here. It's a fixed float. So if you're one of those people that is just running one rod and you're a mono person, you just want simplicity. If you're fishing, let's say a jig, cut that jig off, and you can take just like a snap swivel like this, tie your line to the eye of the barrel swivel that's on the same portion of the eye as the snap. You can either put a Dave's Tangle free weight right on the snap, or if you don't want to spend the money, you can use a slinky. Now obviously you can't fish these quite as deep because a fixed float's a little harder to cast if into deep sections. So this is a system that could get you fishing if you want to just try beads, but you don't want to go through the whole process of setting up that rig that I just explained to you. So now let's talk about the technique, so how to fish a float and bead. Now it's opposite of fishing a float and jig, because with a jig you don't want it touching the bottom. With a bead you want your weighting system touching the bottom, and what that's going to show in your bobber is that you're dragging bottom, which the top of this should be pointing slightly downstream. So if the flow is going this way and this is going down the river, you're going to want it tipped over like this. I like it at about a 45-degree angle. Now if it's laying flat, that means you've probably put too much line between your float and your weighting system. That should be at the river's depth or maybe slightly deeper. Or what this is telling you is you've got a big belly of line and you need to mend your line so that that gets riding more like this. I generally will have strikes when that's floating perfectly just down the river like that. So with float fishing, line management is very important. So I'm going to explain a couple things. These are repeats from part 1, but just in case you came in at part 2. So when I am extending my drift, I generally hold my rod with my pinky and ring finger around my reel seat like this. And that allows me, as that line is going, or as that float's going down the river, it allows me to touch the spool of my line. And that way, if line's coming off, I can put my finger down to stop it. The other thing that I would point out is if you're trying to get that extended drift and you want an uninterrupted float and the line's starting to stick just a little bit on your spool, you can start sweeping your rod back and forth, and that kind of helps pull that off of your spool. When you go to flip your bail, if you can remember to do so, do it manually. Don't use the handle. And what that does is it allows you to keep management of that spool to where your line is tight so you don't end up getting tangles. As far as drag, you want your drag set tight enough that if you have a bobber down and you sweep that rod, that it's going to bury that hook. You generally don't have to do a secondary hook set with float and bead fishing. Those little Skeena hooks are extremely sharp. But you want to remember, tighty-righty, lefty-loosey. So that initial steelhead run, you might want to turn it left a little bit to let that fish do those initial runs so you don't break off. And as the fish tires out, you can start tightening that drag up. So I have a few more tips for you, and we're going to start out with leader storage. Now I use pips boxes. I probably have 10 to a dozen of these things. They're just a way that you can store your bead rigs so that you can have them all tied up at home. So let's go ahead and tie up a bead rig, and I'll demonstrate how these pips boxes work. So I have some of my leader material here, the Seeger. This is 10-pound test. And I've got some Seeger 15-pound test, but let's stick with the 10. What I generally do is I have a tape measure, and I can set that out wherever I'm tying up my rigs. Another little tip is you can take a Sharpie and mark the lengths on a table if it's a table that you don't mind having a little mark on. But for purposes of this, let's just use this tape measure. So I like a 30-inch leader from hook to my swivel, so I start with 42 inches. Now you might ask, well, why would you need 42 inches, an additional 12 inches? Well, I'll explain. Once you actually tie your knot, you're going to shorten your leader up quite a bit, plus you're going to have a tag end, and it's better to have a little bit more than too little. So I'll take my 42 inches of line. I'm going to use a size 1 Skeena hook here. So I'm going to tie my leader material on with an egg loop. If you don't know how to tie an egg loop, Just look it up. I'm sure you can find another video. I don't have one quite yet, but I'll work on it. 7 loops. Another 7. 1, 2. Alright, so I got my egg loop there. So next you're going to want to tie on a system that you can peg your bead, because you want to peg your bead about 1.5 inches above the hook. So these are T-stops by B&R, or you can use a little sequin, which is kind of like a little shiny flat bead that you get from a craft store. They used to actually come with B&R soft beads, but I'm going to use a T-stop for purposes of this. So the T-stops have a little metal loop. You want to put your leader through that loop and just pull the T-stop on. You can slide that down. Now if you choose to, you can actually put your bead on now, but I like to be able to make my bead choice when I'm out in the field. But the T-stop goes on like that. And again, you're gonna wanna peg that 1.5 inches above the hook. So next, I take a measurement to 30 inches. And I use a black Sharpie to make a little mark, because that's where I wanna tie my leader onto my barrel swivel. See, I don't know if you can see that against my face. And if you have a lot of extra material, you can cut some of that off. You probably want about 6 inches for purposes of tying your knot to your barrel swivel. The pips boxes have a little bit of a slot right here. You might have to take the T-stop and slide it back towards the hook just a little bit, because you can adjust that when you're out fishing. But you line that slot up in the pips box, take the hook, bury that into the cork. The newer ones have a foam, and then you put the lid on and you just twist. And that leader material gets pulled up inside that pips box, and it keeps it safe so it doesn't get dinged up when it's in your chest pack or your backpack or whatever you use on the river. So then what I do is I take some of these little stickers like this. I write the date, so 12 of 22. I'm gonna put 10 pound, 30 inch Seeger and number 1 Skeena. Take that and I'll stick that on the pips box, and you can put 6 to 8 liters in each one of these pips boxes. But that way you know which leader material, which hook you're using, and also that if you have one of these floating around for several years, you might want to just cut the line off and retie them. That's why I put the date on them. But during the season, I'll have a bunch of different weights of line tied up with different sizes of hooks. That way it covers all different types of water conditions, but that way I can manage it by just writing it on that little label. So as a bonus, my friend Richard T has created a CAD diagram of this rigging. I'm gonna put that on my Rage Fishing Facebook page and on Instagram at Steelhead Rage. That way you can save those diagrams to your phone and you can have them with you on the river. So if you use these methods, you're gonna catch steelhead if there's steelhead to be caught. So one thing I will ask is, if you catch a wild fish and that's a fish that has an adipose fin, please keep them in the water. If you have to get a photo, only do so if you have a friend available. Once the friend's ready, pick it up ever so slightly, click, click, and get that fish swimming. We need to take care of those wild fish so that we have these fish to go after for years to come. If you want to see this technique further in action, I'm going to pick a video from my channel and put a suggestion at the end, just so you can see how deadly floats and beads are for winter steelhead. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on part 3, drift fishing.